Mr. Ben Patterson
Hey everybody.
is also here running video and audio and all the numbers for us right now. It's so good to be here. Thanks for having us. So we can explain a little bit about Little Bluestem, who we are, what we do, why we do it, and then maybe open the floor to questions and see what kind of a conversation we can have, because there's not a ton of people here, so we can maybe have a little bit more of a productive back and forth here. So Little Bluestem is a cooperatively run nonprofit, which has a hideously complicated internal structure that I won't get into. But what we do is we propagate, so we grow and we distribute and we teach about specifically local genotype or local ecotype native plants from this region. And so that includes a lot of different projects. We grow plants for long-term refugia type projects that are going to hopefully preserve and do right by these species and these specific lineages of these species for the foreseeable future, which we're trying to foresee it 15 to 30 million years out is kind of the horizons we're working with, to give you some sense of the timescales we're working on. We do a lot of educational work. We work with a couple schools. We've been doing that for years with a couple of school systems in Charlottesville and over in the valley, over in Waynesboro and Stanton and some other places in the area. We have a sanctuary site that is 80 acres of woodland in northern Nelson County with springs and a lot of really interesting shrubs, and right now the spring ephemerals are going nuts, so we've been caretaking that spot and kind of doing work parties there on the regular to involve the community and other folks who are interested in this work and sort of teach by doing on that site. And we've also got a nursery, so we sell some plants to regular old gardeners, but mostly the nursery is to produce plants for larger scale distribution, for larger scale projects, for these sort of long-term refugia-based.
Ben, is there some way that you could speak up a little louder? We're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay. Yeah, Ben just turned the monitor up. So is that better?
Yes.
Great. Lily, is there anything you want to throw in on that?
So you covered the educational side of it, that we're tied to the nursery that sells native plants, and that are, so Ben did just gloss over our organizational structure, which yes is complicated, but it's also one of the most beautiful parts of Little Bluestem, is that it is creating something that we don't really have other role models for. There are other groups and organizations that are doing similar things, and so we've learned a lot from them, but in this non-hierarchical structure of governance, it's been an interesting way of structuring our work, which then informs how we work with our communities and the work that we do with the plants. So it's all tied together. The sense of this egalitarian approach to working together.
Yeah, we have no bosses. Our board isn't really a board. It's an advisory council that fulfills certain organizational and design goals, but it's not directorial with relationship to the rest of the nonprofit workers. So designing effective consensus strategies and all that allows us to do things a little differently than a more conventional hierarchical organization with presidents and officers and Robert's Rules of Order and all that stuff, which I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with and understand its shortcomings just as well as we do. So we chose to do things a little differently, and we're discovering that we actually like it a lot better. It's great. We've been able to get a lot of stuff done that was painful and horrible before. Meetings, we love meetings. That's a weird thing to say, but we get a lot done.
It's True.
So if this is at all interesting to anybody other than us, we're happy to talk in exhaustive detail about it in a bit. But I would imagine you being the Native Plant Society, you might want to hear about the plants and what we do with that, so we can do that too. Um, yeah, I guess I can't really tell with this wall of names here what kind of reaction we're getting, so I'm just going to assume that you're loving what we're saying. Okay. Let's see. Should I talk about the genotype thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the aspects that we're particularly focused on is kind of going beyond species, right? So there's a lot of attention on native species, native plants. That's kind of an easy handle for a lot of folks to get around, and that's great. You need a handle when you're looking at the otherwise green wall of the wild of nature. You got to start somewhere, and taxonomy is a business of splitting and lumping, right? You've got some folks who tend to split things apart into that which is not like the other thing, and folks who tend to lump things together. I wonder if that has anything to do with the tendency of botanists to either be nibblers or sniffers. If you know that dichotomy of those who recognize fine distinctions in plants by crushing up a bit of botanical material and either eating it or sticking it up their nose. Maybe these are just people that I've hung out with. I don't know. Anyway, lumping and splitting, right? So, here's an interesting story. So a friend of mine makes tulip poplar bark baskets for a living, and she learned her skill from some of the old timers around here. And they recognized, or at least her teachers recognized, between 5 and 7 different distinct, they called them species. We might call them phenotypes or morphs, or actual species if somebody went and did the genetics on it, of tulip poplar, which we recognize as one species, Liriodendron tulipifera. There's another Liriodendron over in China, but that doesn't count right now. Anyway, their understanding, because they work with these plants, all the time, they're able to see these very distinct, at the very least, phenotypes, patterns of how the form of the plant arranges itself. That, as far as I know, no published literature really deals with. I don't know if that understanding would be dismissed as anecdotal or not, but a lot of that sort of understanding is dismissed as anecdotal, as though it doesn't count, as though that knowledge, that awareness that's based on material engagement with the organisms, if it's not done by a qualified observer, it's not somehow real. That's kind of nonsense. Where it overlaps in some of the more established or authorized version of events is looking at the genotype of an organism. So that's its genetic code, as broad and wide and unspecific as a category as that is. And I'm not going to go much more detailed than that for now, because the broad strokes are honestly more interesting than the nitty-gritty details of this, at least. So the idea is that on beyond species, which is a broad, wide, handy taxonomical category for us to get a sense of the wild, there are finer distinctions. A tulip poplar growing in this valley is very different than a tulip poplar growing in that valley. And each group of tulip poplars has, as we understand anyway, intrinsic value. They're worth doing right by, even though the same name is applied to this group and that group. And you can say, well, it doesn't really matter that much if this particular population is destroyed in the pursuit of some real estate agent's personal profits. Whatever, there's another group of Liriodendron tulipifera the next hollow over. So we're fine, right? The species is contained and the species is all one thing, except it's not.
Excuse me, we need you to be louder.
All right. I think we got the monitor turned up again. It's as high as it goes. I'm sorry. This is just the way my voice works.
It might help to speak a little more slowly too.
There's a volume control on y'all's end. Try that too. So.
Would it help if we put both of these on you?
No. Just kidding.
I tried.
How's this? Better? Okay.
Ask me if it's any
Is it any better, Ben? Oh, sorry. How's that sound? Is that doing y'all better? I can't actually see you.
Still
Good.
hard to
Oh,
Can't
weird.
hear.
This is really loud in my headphones right now.
Here, let's turn your headphones down. And then
Okay.
you can yell a little more.
All right, now I can't hear anything at all.
Okay.
So you just
you
turn
go
them
ahead.
off.
You go
There we
ahead.
Yeah, I gotta have the monitor turned on. There we are. I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, the basic concept of working with local genotypes, making sure to propagate the plants that we are growing, to source those seeds, and we source all of our stuff from stuff we either collect by hand ourselves, or we work with a couple of other organizations in the area, Hummingbird Hill, Center for Urban Habitats, again, a couple of schools in the area. So we share seed with a bunch of folks, but we're very careful to gather it responsibly. We use the 1/10 rule. Never take more than from 1 out of every 10 plants. Never take more than 1/10 of the total seed available. And honestly, when you're collecting, you're usually getting like a 50th of what's around in some of these stands. Anyway, making sure to record where we're getting the stuff. Some of the characteristics of the plants themselves there, and then comparing notes again with these other organizations to establish these unique separate populations. Because as more and more genetic research is done to actually sequence the genes of plants that have very broad phenotypic expression, the expression of physical form, they're finding that there's actually some very real genetic differences on beyond what we're usually used to as considering all one species. So why does this matter, right? I mean, you've got one slightly different tulip poplar or mountain mint in this valley than the other valley, so what? It's all more or less the same. Can't we all just get along with highways, slicing it all up into subdivisions, and so long as we've got some of it in a garden somewhere, that's good enough, right? Well, no, not really. There's a concept that we work with that's called the minimum viable population, or MVP. And so that is the basic unit of extinction. Because in an extinction event, which is a period of Earth's history where a lot of species stop being alive, are going extinct in relatively rapid succession, there are fewer different types of organisms alive on this planet now than there were 20 minutes ago, now than there were a minute ago, now than there were a second ago. The speed at which this is happening is kind of ridiculous right now. There are some very real concerns that once the population of something that appears common or trivial or uninteresting drops below a certain amount, there won't be any more of anything remotely like that in the region forever and anon. And so our understanding of taxonomy is a handy handle for human being folks who speak English and also crazy science Latin to get a handle on what's going on in nature around here. Its actual functioning is far more fine-grained. So it's kind of important to preserve as broad a spread as possible of the currently extant native plant populations, native organism populations of anything in a region, basically as a hedge against that entire ecosystem going belly up when some keystone, which we didn't realize was a keystone, happens to be turned into a shopping center. Whoops. There goes the forest. So a minimum viable population is the smallest possible group of organisms of a certain type that will continue to produce more of that type of organism. Lose one of those individuals, the whole population goes in a downward spiral, what they call an extinction vortex in comic book language, I guess. but it really is. I mean, the graphs of these things have a ton of feed-ins, things like excessive daytime nighttime temperature fluctuations, summer winter soil moisture percentages that are above a certain maximum threshold for plants. I mean, you've all grown plants, you know how finicky some of them can be and how tough some of them can be, and how the same kind of environmental pressures apply to all of them. Same deal, just on a broader scale, right? So, our goal is to combination life support, arc building, and triage. So isolating and identifying those environments, those places geographically within our region, which look like they are probably pretty stable, relatively speaking, for the next, as long as these types of climatic disturbances seem likely to continue, which is looking to be about 15 to 20 million years if we're going to use as an analog the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which was the last time there was an analogous sort of major global warming, global climate destabilization event. That one happened a lot slower. It happened over a period of millions of years, whereas this one has happened over a period of thousands of years. But, similar-ish process. And that one kind of underwent a series of spikes and troughs over about 15 odd million years. So these are the horizons we're talking about. So we're looking at places that are buffered against high storm winds, for instance, that have old springs and streams in the bottom that would keep soil moisture relatively high in the event of 30-year droughts. That would be buffered against the kind of winds that would carry crowning forest fires. Because again, we're looking at a period of years in which the land is almost guaranteed to experience earthquake, hurricane, fire, let alone whatever industrialized humans do to the area. So that's one part. Look at those landscapes and see, all right, what's growing here already? Is it somewhere in the vicinity of the minimum viable population for these populations currently extant? And if not, how can we bolster them? And if so, how can we assist it and make sure that politically these areas are not going to be sold, chopped down willy-nilly, denuded of forest, polluted, etc. That's one part. The second is to look at areas which are not suitable, that might seem promising because it's in like the backyard of a school or something, or in our personal backyards, and say, well, this is probably not going to stay forest. The organisms that are growing here now probably aren't going to keep growing here come hell and high water. So let's not focus on this area, to make a triage map essentially and say, what seems likely to stand the test of time and what probably doesn't. Doesn't mean those landscapes are worthless, doesn't mean those landscapes aren't beautiful, doesn't mean we don't love those places, doesn't mean they don't have a chance. It just means that if we're really in it for species preservation over the long haul, we've only got so many calories and so many minutes in our lives, and we need to apply them at the point of greatest leverage. And the third part is to take the concept of minimum viable population and extrapolate and iterate on that. There is a related concept called the minimum viable metapopulation, which is the minimum number of minimum viable populations necessary in order to sustain that, let's call it a species for shorthand, that species in that broader bioregion. And so that, just to make things extra complicated, those minimum viable populations can be, all kinds of fragmented nonsense. I mean, you could have something that is totally unsuitable for sustenance for 15 million years, but you could probably keep it up for the next 20. And looking ahead at the social dynamics of that neighborhood, you could potentially keep it going for the next 200 if you train the kids up right. So that becomes valuable as kind of a carrier spot. So there's sort of two different ways of constructing refugia that we're looking at. One is, straight continuity of landscapes that are already well suited and keeping them going. And the other is stitching together bits and pieces to, just like soccer players passing a ball down the field to one another to get to the goal, this population of, say, world milkweed is going to live for the next 200 years in this set of cul-de-sacs, which will eventually be prairie, which is eventually going to turn to desert. And then there's something encoded into the cultural lineage and the storytelling of that place that then, after it becomes uninhabitable, the descendants of that area are going to take those seeds and move them somewhere else and join up with another section that's, at or below minimum viable population then, and carry it there. This is all a little far-fetched seeming maybe, but the stakes are, well, you can feel it in your bones what the stakes are. Basically it's taking the fear and the sense of threat and the sense of sorrow that comes along with living in a world that seems beset on all sides, where we see more gray than green every year when we hear stories of mass death of whales, of migrating birds, of how many hectares per second are gone from the Amazon rainforest, how much plastic there is in our bodies, how much plastic there is in the oceans, and all of that extreme grief and anger and sorrow, and not letting it get to us. We go through it and we say, well, given that that's the context, that's where we start, and what do we go from here, right? We're not going to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that reality as we understand it isn't real, that just because this is uncomfortable, it isn't happening. We got to live with it, but we're not just going to sit in the trouble, not just going to stay with the trouble, but move through it and look at how can we live fulfilling lives of benefit to our broader ecosystem. And this is one way of doing it. It's not the only way. It's not the right way. There are so many things to be done. This just happens to be our particular area since we like growing plants. So, I've been going on for a long while. Do you guys have anything you want to throw in there?
I'm wondering if we have any questions at this point. If there were any questions on some of the things that you were outlining.
Yeah. How y'all doing out there?
Well, we can't hear well enough to ask questions.
Dave, you raised your hand. Do you have a question? Did you?
Yes, yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Well, I was wondering what Ben, what kind of projects do they work on? I guess he's not selling to small growers. What sorts of things does he do with his plants?
So, like I said, we distribute them. We got a project going right now to start with the neighborhood which the nursery is located in, which is one of these places that seems like geographically it's pretty well situated for a long haul resilience in the face of extreme climatic events. It's certainly seen its share of hurricanes and ice storms and so on for the past 30 years in recent living memory, without a tremendous amount of destruction. And there's a lot of old woods already there. So we're distributing plants to the neighbors who love it, or planting them, and generally just increasing the population capacity, the genetic capacity of that region. And so this is sort of the pilot project. We're 1 year old. We just started this, by the way. So I know it sounds like we've got a lot going on, and we do, but this is the beginning of a long process, not by no means the middle point. So through working with our neighbors who are already friends and amenable to us, this is a good kind of soft open to work through some of the kinks of this type of community engagement project. And so we hope to work with other neighborhood-based communities in a similar way. Kind of the whole thing is set up to favor group project support over individual project support. There's nothing wrong with growing your own individual backyard garden. It's great. Everybody should do it. But get a note from Ben here from the thing. But we're mostly focused on, again, these sorts of projects that have the capacity for intergenerational support. And that's most likely within a neighborhood or community or an organization rather than an individual. So I've got a question here. Isn't it important to keep the general gene pool to combat climate change, thus not keeping exact phenotype to render the gene pool resilient to climate change? Yes, if I understand your question correctly. Breadth, right. It's about preserving the breadth, which is why we're looking at genotype rather than species as kind of the unit of taxonomic organization that we're planning around. So we've got, Pycnanthemum muticum that comes from central Nelson County over by Nelly's Ford area, and we've got some that's up on Pantops Mountain outside of Charlottesville, and we've got some that's from Afton Mountain area, kind of halfway between Waynesboro and Crozet. So all of these are all worth preserving and noting what they are. We got another one coming in the chat. What do we think of assisted migration? I think it's a great idea. It's something I've been talking with some friends and colleagues down in North Carolina about their projects migrating bald cypress up from the south and inland from the coasts, in part to take the role of hemlock trees, as the hemlock trees in the mountains have been decimated by the woolly adelgid. So they've been basically hustling up these plants. So as far as assisted migration up from the south, yeah, also necessary. It's tricky because often with assisted migration, we're mostly talking about the kind of charismatic organisms that are roughly human scale, that we can see, that we perceive, that we notice in the landscape, but not necessarily all of their symbiotic partner organisms, all the bacteria and fungi and actinomycetes and soil protists and so on that they're dependent on or that would greatly assist them as well. So, certainly some work will need to be done in that. And depending on the timelines for all this, either we do a bunch of studies and we figure out the optimal way to do this, or we throw a lot of mud at the wall and hope that some of it sticks. And absolutely we'll make some mistakes along the way and hope that they aren't too dire. But I'm pretty sure that jumping endemic species to this continent is probably going to be less horrifically deleterious than, say, importing parasitoid wasps to eat the non-native caterpillars that were accidentally introduced, and then, oops, they eat all of our native big moths as a byproduct. And also it turns out that those caterpillars that they were brought in to devour were pretty quickly population adjusted just by the native indigenous bird population. It just took them 50 years to get used to the population cycles. Hello, gypsy moths. Anyway, I think we got another question coming in on the chat.
Back to your first question.
Thanks. What we're doing here, so we have it set up so there's a screen that I'm looking at that you can't see, that the texts are coming in on, and then our producer is taking screen captures onto a telephone and then handing them to me. So this is very high-tech, low-tech here. All right, but genotype specifies a particular area rather than the full breadth of the species gene pool. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Well, also, so species isn't the end-all and be-all of our understanding of an organism's taxonomic identity. Genotype and ecotype I'm using here sloppily interchangeably because practically we're not taking gene readers out to the field to actually assess the specific genetic markers of this or that population. We're making the absolutely debatable assumption that a phenotypically consistent set of organisms growing in a general place, the ecotype would have some sort of genotypic resonance. Anyway, one of our colleagues in the business said, you should call it genotype rather than ecotype. It's more specific. I said, okay, fine, we'll just do it. But if you just translate ecotype or genotype to ecotype, if it seems like a more precise mode of conversation. Some people prefer one, some prefer the other.
Is there another one?
There's another one on there. Okay, yeah, sorry, I see that now. Feel free to drop questions here. I will. Oh, no.
Go to the side.
There we go, thanks. What means of support do you have for your work? Not enough. Yeah, we've been applying for a bunch of grants. We got a very generous match grant donation from a big organization, and so right now we are stitching together a whole bunch of everything from postage stamp penny donations to some more grant funding, some more things like that. We do have, I forgot to mention before, part of what we do is a podcast, educational podcast called For Our Sins, By the Seed of Our Plants.
Say it again.
By the seed of our plants.
So good.
We can send you a link to, I guess, send around. But it's at our website, littlebluestem.net. You can tie in on that. But we've got a Patreon there that people are welcome to subscribe to and kick us a couple of bucks a month. You get some extra freebie stuff and access to all the episodes, which are free anyway. But that's another process. Okay, got another question
Well,
here.
I just want to jump in on
Oh, yeah,
that.
go for it.
On the support needed is that.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I want to let everybody know that the majority, everything that is done by Little Bluestem, is volunteer at this point. So any support that you can give will allow us to spend more time on this work that is what's driving us in the world these days. So any support would be very welcome.
Yeah.
And doubled right now by
Yeah.
our generous match donor.
That's good. Thanks. Yeah. Do you have a certain number of species you are working with? Yeah, all of them. I mean, we are mostly focused on, because of our growing facilities, we have focused a lot on Piedmont prairie species. So we've grown a lot of grasses, Little Bluestem obviously, but a lot of the love grasses, the Aragrostis, and then also some woodland and forest species. There's about, I don't know, probably about 100 species or so on our growing list that we've either grown in the past or currently growing, have in propagation beds, etc. So, we're not as focused on woodland stuff, spring ephemerals and so on, but that's just because we haven't had the greenhouse facilities that are particularly good for those species, and instead we've been focusing on the stuff that it's easy to grow in an unheated greenhouse and outside on nursery yard benches. So, a lot of grasses. Go. Got another question? All right. What do I think of assisted migration? Yeah, it's great. We love it. I think it's a really important thing to do. There's not a ton of research on it, but honestly, that's fine. We should just try to do it. We don't have a lot of time before it becomes very difficult to do this kind of work. So.
And isn't that what you were alluding to earlier when you were talking about, for example, the milkweed in a cul-de-sac that will become prairie, that will become desert,
Yeah.
and that hopefully then people will take that and move it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Assisted migration is something that is not only happening in real time, but also we need to be teaching people about it.
Right.
So that future generations can then carry it out.
Absolutely. That the projects that we're interested in engaging and working on are not just this generation's individuals' personal interest in growing plants. It's about how culturally can we become a culture that is of place, a society whose material interests are tied in with the actual interests of the landscape we inhabit. How do we convince that through active engagement relationship, like those tulip poplar bark basket making guys? Their livelihood was tied up in the health of the landscape. You bet they're not going to clear cut a patch, because that's the next 25 years of income for them. So that I'm not saying literally everybody needs to go out and make tulip tulip poplar. I need to not using that as an example anymore because I can't even say it. But you know what I'm saying. That type of practical relationship is one that engaged in as a group, you know, on beyond the family unit, with neighbors, with friends, in a coherent, you know, self-motivating way, is more likely to keep on going down the line.
Yeah, and to use those words more often so they become an easy part of the language that doesn't die.
Yeah. Tulip, poplar, bark, basket. Say that 10 times fast. All right, we got a few more here. Great. Thanks so much for these questions. This is great, y'all. All right. Who identifies the phenotypes for you? So this is a lot of our work with these is with Center for Urban Habitats. That's Devin and Rachel Floyd and their many, many, many helpers, assistants, colleagues, field techs, and so on. So they are excellent plant ID folks. You know, we're no slouches ourselves, but they've really helped. They've gotten some great grant funding to do specific population research in the past, and they've been very generous in sharing what they've come up with us. They're right now working on a project to look at pycnanthemum species. That's the mountain mint around here. And as we've all noticed from growing it, that individual populations of mountain mint, even of the same species, Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, for example, that's the narrowleaf mountain mint, tends to be really, really different from one population to the next. And as it turns out, genetically, it's very diverse. There's a lot of different expressions there, to the point where, again, calling it all Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, lumping into one species, may not be that useful. So there's just so many subspecies. So getting into more of that nitty-gritty detail is something that they're very passionate about, and we're happy to work with them on that. I think we got another question here that's
Making its way
making
over.
its way through but doesn't that mean moving ecotypes to a different ecosystem, or am I misunderstanding your point? Yeah, so this is a fine point, and this is kind of the fuzzy gray area between assisted migration and local ecotype or local genotype preservation in situ. And it kind of again comes down to the issue of triage, is where seems like the sorts of places that are liable to sustain given the types of extinction level pressures we're experiencing now and are likely to experience in the foreseeable future. So ideally, we want to preserve local ecotype, local genotype lineages for as long, forever. I mean, they're beautiful plants. We love them. We're not going to sell them short because it's inconvenient. However, it may be inevitable for certain already super small populations of local ecotype species that they're very close to the minimum viable for those populations. And at that point, introducing non-local ecotypes of those species is what it's going to take in order for those populations to survive at all. So a good reason not to be too doctrinaire about, or too hyper-local when it comes to what is local and what is not. Now that's one grade on the gradient. The other side of that that we feel pretty strongly about is, for instance, things like nativars, which are cultivars of native species that have been bred to have differently colored blooms or different blooming schedules or different nectar propensities. And these we encourage people to please don't plant. Please don't buy them. Please don't promote them. They have the potential to wreck native populations completely. You say, well, aren't they just a different set of fresh genes to introduce and boost a local population up beyond the minimum? Well, yes and no. They also happen to have a lot of traits that are basically maladaptive outside of a garden setting, or potentially maladaptive because a lot of the breeding results from leveraging inbreeding, which is already pushes a population towards what they call inbreeding depression, which is increasing the likelihood of maladaptive traits developing the less total genetic diversity there is for the population. That's one of the things that feeds into the extinction vortex. So if you have a pretty bright purple milkweed that's the same species as your, I would say, prettier, but some people would say less pretty, native pink milkweed, that pretty purple milkweed might also not have the kind of nectaries that your local hummingbirds really like and have come to rely on. Or it might not be as cold tolerant or as drought tolerant or something like that. So those alleles, those genetic markers, might make it into your local gene pool. And so just when times are hardest, something maladaptive might express itself out of that genetic code that it inherited from that cultivar milkweed, and then the whole population is kaput. And that's terrible. So hedging our bets against that. So, and there's kind of a big gray area in between those two, which is, for instance, bringing in mass-produced seed from big single genotype operations. Big seed companies like Ernst, for instance, grows acres and acres and acres of single species at a time, often from a fairly narrow set of genetic lineages to begin with. So on the one hand, this could introduce a whole new set of genes that could artificially keep a population going a little longer because it's got a little bit more genetic diversity in there. It'll keep the inbreeding depression out a little bit longer. On the other hand, it might be kind of inbred at that point. Like if you're growing acres of seeds for 40 years at a stretch, you know, a lot of that seed is replanted seed that's been grown before. So the population pressures may already be impending there. And so whether the specifics of a given site are dire enough or generous enough to require more or less specificity with your sourcing of genotype or ecotype, it's site specific. And so that's why I'm talking about like a gradient rather than an absolute rule. Although please don't plant nativars. They're just awful. Let's see. We got something else coming on the wire. We're good?
That's it.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. How are we for time? Are we come on here, yeah?
Yeah, we're fine. So if there's nothing else, then we want to thank you for your talk and getting everybody to ask questions and everything about your work. So that was very interesting. So you've got material on your website too to explain what you're doing in that too, from what I was seeing. So if anybody else wants to visit your website, they're welcome to. So
And on the website, you'll also see the link to our podcast, which has more storytelling and conversations about all of this stuff.
okay, good. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all for having us out here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun to talk back and forth. Great questions, y'all. And yeah, happy growing.
Okay,
Springtime.
good. Thank you. Okay, so everybody, hopefully we'll see you back in May for our picnic then. And I'll send out the material about National Forest Appreciation Day and a few other items that I mentioned. So good night, everybody.